Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Grace Under Fire by Jennifer Rains, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. To hell with the naysayers and the doubters. She didn't give a tinker's cuss what they thought. Grace Anderson was slowly winning over the town. Next, she planned to charm the valley. It might have taken the Northern New South Wales Field Day Committee a few years to come to the party, but here she was, artisan cheesemaker with her own booth, her own banners, and her own prize-winning products. Grace Anderson's farmhouse cheeses were smack bang in the middle of the exhibition hall, in the middle of the Northern Rivers showground, reaping the benefits of the biggest crowds on record. A single bite of her pale golden cheddar with its hint of sharpness, and people were hooked. Her first experiment in unique cheese, it held prime place in her heart. It also won more blue ribbons than her soft cheeses, but a few more years and competitions would change that. More than a decade of unrelenting work was starting to pay off. An announcement cut through the buzz of the crowd. The video presentation on the removal of woody weeds and revegetation with local native species will start in 10 minutes. Grace's order book was bulging, and she'd made a few solid business contacts today. She didn't mind the work, and the taste of success was sweet. Shoving her hands in the back pockets of her jeans, she rocked back on her heels and allowed herself a grin. "You look pleased with yourself," her sister Ella said. "I am." Grace leaned across the counter to hug her sister, placing a hand gently on the baby sling housing her 4-month-old nephew, and held on. "Hug me!" The imperious demand from below the counter had Grace drawing back and backpedaling to come around the side of the booth. Ella had nursed their youngest sister, Chrissy, until her death 2 years ago, and adopted her daughter. Grace crouched to Tessa's height, and the little girl stepped into her arms. Her niece smelled of vanilla and Ella's soap. Tessa wrapped her sturdy 4-year-old legs around Grace's waist, anchoring herself in place. Grace grinned at her sister. "When did you get here?" "About a half hour ago." "And Jake?" "Seduced by a ride-on mower." Ella nodded in the direction of the pavilion showcasing farm machinery. "Shiny paint, huge wheels, and gargantuan blades. The perfect toy for a hotshot Sydney lawyer who lives in an apartment." "How's the house hunting going?" Normal chit-chat when her sister's visit this weekend was anything but normal. "We've found a bungalow with wide verandas and a large garden." Ella's hand cupped her baby's bottom. "Perfect for the kids. Jake's put in an offer." "Fingers crossed." Grace held crossed fingers in front of Tessa, who mimicked her action. "A bit higher than the budget we planned," Ella confessed. "Budgets rarely match dreams. I've fallen for a German curd vat." Grace winced. "Much more than the budget I planned." "Are you hurting?" Tessa caught Grace's chin, turning Grace's face towards her. "Kiss it better?" Grace pointed to her cheek, and the child planted a sloppy kiss. "How much longer will you be here?" Ella gestured around the hall. "A few hours. Packing up will take another hour. I should be at the farm by about 7. "Any clues why Mom and Dad called the meeting?" Ella's inquiry was laced with concern. "You know what they're like. A united team." Grace had never known a time when her parents' love wasn't strong and real, an aura tangible enough to reach out and touch. A family meeting only starts when all the family's present. But Mom's not getting any stronger. She'd borne witness to her mother's steady decline in recent months. Simple household tasks became harder by the day. Her mother thought Grace didn't notice the tricks her mother had adopted to disguise her frailty. Grace gave her the dignity of pretending not to see. She's still struggling from her last bout of pneumonia. "Tell me." With 2 words, her sister shouldered some of Grace's burden. "She couldn't make the bed by herself." Grace blinked back tears. Yesterday, she'd found her mother sitting on the side of the bed, her fingers caught in the folds of the fitted bottom sheet, trying to push it over the corner of the mattress. Grace had made up some story to explain her arrival, said she needed something only her mother could find. She'd coaxed her mother out of the room, then remade the bed. "I think they saw another specialist." "Since our call last week?" Ella brushed the back of her hand across Grace's cheek. "Are you trying to make me cry?" Grace sniffed, then winked at Tessa. "Another kiss to make it better?" The child held Grace's face with both hands and placed a solemn kiss on each cheek. Grace spun in a circle, delighting in Tessa's squeals of joy. "I didn't say anything about the bed." "Just like you haven't said anything about taking over shopping, the housework, and the cooking?" Ella pumped Grace for details every time they talked. It's not hard to knock up extra casseroles and soups. They can eat them if they want, though. The food disappeared almost as fast as Grace put it in the freezer. They're intelligent people. They must know it can't go on like this. They went to town Thursday morning. Dad asked me to do the afternoon milking, even though they were home. She spent a sleepless night parsing out the implications of her father's absence from the shed. She could count on one hand the number of times he'd skipped milking over the years. We'll insist on an answer this time, Ella said firmly. For a family that talks about everything, they've been uncharacteristically closed-mouthed about this. Grace taking on more work didn't make a damn bit of difference to her mother's health. Grace nuzzled against Tessa's neck, the little girl's giggles of quiet comfort, smoothing over the tight clumps of anxiety holding Grace's body hostage. Hi, EJ. Grace. The deep male voice, honey and smoke, brought Grace's head up, her antenna on alert. Tessa protested at her firmer grip. Grace hadn't seen him arrive, and with her sister as an audience, couldn't avoid the contact. Ryan Wilson was 6'2" and topped her by a good 4 inches. His broad shoulders were encased in standard dairy country uniform of blue chambray and sleeveless polyfiber jacket. The dark moleskins and battered R.M. Williams boots were another tell of Australian country boy. Ditto with the wide-brimmed akabra perched on his head. Dark reflective sunglasses hid his eyes, but his mouth was set in a straight line above a square jaw. His skin was tanned to a burnished gold, chamois soft for a man who lived his life outdoors. Word was Ryan Wilson had lived outdoors in the 8 years he'd been absent from the valley. Ryan, Ella's ready smile curved in greeting. Sorry I've missed you my last few visits home. We haven't left the farm. Grace had been avoiding personal encounters with him in the 2 years since he'd been home. Quite a feat, given they were neighbors. His mouth relaxed into a half smile. You've been busy since I last saw you. Meet Tiger. Ella rested her hand on her son's head. Tiger? He was on the move even in the womb. Ella laughed. His birth certificate says Kit. She pointed at the child in Grace's arms. Tessa's grown a bit. Did you want something? Grace drew herself up to her full height. He had the edge, but she didn't back away. The prickle of awareness was new to her and oddly disorienting. So he turned into a hunk. Just saying hello to all the new stall holders as a member of the field day committee. Ryan dared Grace to object. Doggy! Tessa squealed. Jake continued. Asking if there's anything we can do to improve your experience? He could take himself off like he had 10 years ago. Annoyance did battle with basic politeness. I'm fine. On the committee? Ella teased. The Wilson boy made good. A mover and a shaker, he said. He replied ironically. Doggy! Tessa wriggled in Grace's arms, straining to get down. Grace squatted to face the 3-legged mixed breed leaning against Ryan, keeping Tessa within the secure circle of her arms. Ryan could have approached Grace at any time during the long day. Instead, he'd used Ella to run interference. His tacit acknowledgement of Grace's confused hostility gave her pause. Her newfound edginess around him was as welcome as tick-borne disease in her cows and shredded the good manners her parents had taught her. Tessa would love a dog, Ella murmured. The oh no in her sister's voice had Grace hiding her grin. Maybe not yet. Ella rubbed Kit's back. Tess, say hello to Ryan. He might introduce you. Tessa lifted her head, tilted it further back, and giggling, toppled back against Grace. Hello, big man. He hunkered down and slid a hand over the dog's head, caressing one ear while encouraging the brown and white mutt to sit. His tongue lolled out the side of his mouth, and his liquid brown eyes adoringly followed Ryan's every move. Hi, Tessa. This is Satan. Ryan introduced his companion. Figures. Grace wished she could see through those glasses, see if there was any hint of apology in Ryan's eyes. It melt your bones brown, not that she'd paid much attention to him years ago on the school bus. He'd been in Ella's class, whereas his younger brother Danny had been in Grace's. The brothers had shared the same dark brown hair and eyes, the same rangy build. The stab of grief for Danny ambushed her, one of the reasons she'd kept her distance since Ryan's return. How'd he get his name? Grace snatched at the conversational lifeline. Fought through hellfire to save a few lives, or his namesake from World War I did. This one alerted us to a fire in a cabin, didn't you, boy? Ryan crooned. We got the workers out safely, but his leg was badly burned, had to amputate. He'd wrong-footed her again by showing a sensitive side. Oh, poor baby. Grace stretched out a hand to the dog and waited until he accepted it before patting him. Like this, Tess. He's very gentle, likes kids. Ryan's hand covered Tessa's, bringing him closer to Grace, close enough for her to smell man and shared history. Her breath caught in her throat as past and present collided. Good doggy. Ellie? Tessa screwed up her eyes against the sun. I want doggy. I know you do, darling, Ella murmured. We can talk about it with Jake. She looks like Chrissy. Ryan lowered his voice so only Grace could hear. When she nodded, he continued. I'm sorry Chrissy died. I haven't had the chance to tell you. I'm sorry about Dan. Oldest Bear erupted in a messy accusation. You never gave me a chance to tell you. Ella winced at her sharp response, but Grace had looked to Ryan in the church 10 years ago for help to make sense of the madness, for reassurance, to see if he shared her sense of loss or waste, of guilt in not being able to prevent Danny's death. Ryan had refused to talk to her after Danny's funeral, abandoning her to suffocating grief. Ryan had been 17 then to her 15, as tall as now, but gangly. He hadn't grown into his build, but the promise of the man had been there. His shaggy hair had been longer, not long enough to hide his tight, shuttered expression. The pain of Ryan's rejection had smoldered again inside her, only to flare up now. He'd left town straight after her best friend Danny's funeral. Hadn't stayed for the wake or to listen to community condolences. Ryan had spoken to no one, not even her, then disappeared. When his mother needed him. Grace had struggled to forgive him for that, too. She'd taught herself not to need him, not to need anyone other than family. I'm sorry I didn't speak to you. He rose abruptly to his feet, his hands held up in front of him. She rose with him. Her heart hammered, her hands balled, and her legs were planted wide in defiance. Are these handmade? A short, wide woman in a rose-patterned dress had peeled off from the noisy pack, surging through the hall and stood at her stall. Grace scurried to the counter, a plastic smile plastered in place. Yes, farmhouse cheeses from Blue Sky Farm in the Ridgeway Valley. Can I try? The woman gestured to the two breadboards, one spilling over with crackers and chunks of fruit bread, with a large wedge of her crumbly cheddar in central position. The second hosted her soft cheeses, a less rustic display, more a sophisticated cheese platter presented as you might a share plate at an award-winning restaurant. What would you like first? The potential customer held only half of Grace's attention, although her patter was too well honed for the woman to detect her distraction. Ryan and his giveaway nothing reflective sunglasses occupied her peripheral vision. Ella had always defended him for leaving town. Hers was an easy friendship with him, something Grace couldn't imagine for herself. Nice to catch up with you, EJ. Ryan turned to walk away. Ella caught his elbow and linked arms. Why don't you escort Tessa and me back to Jake so I can introduce you? She made a face at Grace, promising a reprimand later tonight for her churlish sniping. See you later, Grace. The cheddar, Ms. Rose Pattern said. Grace lost her temper when her heart couldn't make sense of her world, which only compounded her sense of helplessness. She should have politely accepted Ryan's condolences for Chrissy. Instead, let her rip Gracie had ripped into him, reminding him of that dreadful day. Her gut clenched in contrition. From his reaction, she'd catapulted him back to the incomprehensible hell they'd inhabited after Danny's death. Can I try the cheddar? Ms. Patient Rose Pattern had to repeat her choice. The woman skewered the chunk Grace cut with a toothpick, wrinkled her nose as she savored its earthy scent, then popped it in her mouth. I like it. The woman reached for the second chunk Grace had cut. What's your average cheddar weight? About 12 kilos. Grace braced for the verdict, always personal when it was her own creation. I'll take one. I just love the branding. Pretty girls. Is that from the nursery rhyme? Ms. Rose Pattern leaned closer. Are you one of those three girls in the frilly blouses sitting on a bench in the photo on your label? Grace raised her voice to compete with the booming announcement of the winning ticket for the door prize. I'm the middle sister. My Nana loved that photo, called it Pretty Girls all in a row. Except now Grace had only one sister. That's sweet. Ms. Rose Pattern gave Grace a shrewd look. And your blouse matches the one in the photo. Clever marketing. I'm guessing Blue Sky's your farm. Family owned and run for 4 generations. When Grace took over, it would be 5. The continuity was a rhythm beating in her blood, a source of pride as well as a passion. For now, she operated as a subtenant, working and living out of their old house her grandparents had lived in until their deaths. Was that your sister and her husband? Ms. Chatty Rose Pattern stared at Ryan's retreating back, giving Grace permission to do the same. Ella's my sister. Ryan's not Ella's husband. Relief pushed jumpy sparks of alarm along Grace's synapses. I am not interested. Ryan's a neighbor. He's reason enough to move to the country. The woman's low-voiced chuckle brought Grace's gaze back to her. Easy on the eye, the woman commented. Do your sisters work in the business? They had other dreams. Unnecessary to explain her beautiful younger sister's early death from an aggressive cancer 2 years ago. Grace processed the payment, putting the cheese into one of the sturdy cloth bags she designed and made, and added one of her business cards. I've given you my card, she smiled, in case you want more. Do you need help getting this to your car? I'm fine, and I feel sure you'll be hearing from me. Ms. Rosepattern rejoined the river of people winding through the stalls. Ryan was aware of Grace's gaze on him as he walked away. He'd planned to approach her today. They'd done enough pussyfooting around. She avoided him at all those community functions where their paths crossed, but they were next-door neighbors as well as business people in a small community, and their standoff was starting to generate gossip, enough to have his mother asking him questions. Are you here long? Ryan asked. He'd intended to use his role as a committee member to approach the booth. EJ's arrival made it simple. He was sure of a welcome from her. Every time Grace saw him, she donned some invisible cloak of disdain to repel him, giving him the brush off without saying a word. Her outburst gave him an answer. She blamed him for a silence at the funeral which had taken every ounce of his self-control to maintain. A few days. There's Jake, Ella signaled, but Tessa had already taken off at a run to be caught and lifted high by a grinning pirate of a man with a ponytail and earring. Not quite what I expected, Ryan murmured. That was my reaction when I met him. Ella released his arm. Jake, this is Ryan Wilson, a friend. Ryan, meet my husband. I've heard about you, Jake offered a hand. No need to clam up, just general stuff about how you and your brother, Eleanor and Grace, grew up together. Grace and Danny bonded as preschoolers. EJ leaned into her husband, each of them holding a child, the four of them a solid unit. Ties Ryan avoided. They were close, he agreed, and despite having different dreams, stayed close. He rubbed the back of his neck. Maybe their dreams hadn't been so different. It required creativity as well as determination to produce unique cheeses. Danny had wanted to do graphic design, although that was one secret they'd managed to keep from the small-minded, small-town busybodies who'd dismissed the creative arts as unmanly. Mom used to say they were joined at the hip. EJ faced the truth head-on. Grace adored him. Grace had shouted at Ryan at Danny's funeral, although he hadn't heard a word past the roaring in his ears. He'd seen her mouth moving, her arms waving, and hot tears pouring unchecked down her cheeks. If he'd tried to speak, he would have shouted too. Not at her. At the sanctimonious school principal who expelled Danny for sharing a kiss, and the bigots who'd taunted Danny. Shouting at the cowards who'd driven his brother to suicide would have turned it to fighting. Ryan had wanted to beat the shit out of someone that day, but he'd clamped it down. For Danny, for his gentle brother Danny. Then Ryan had got the hell out, planned never to return. I know. His powerlessness was another regret. He hadn't been able to find any words for her. He'd let Grace down, too. More casual small talk, an easy goodbye. EJ or Eleanor Jane, too big a mouthful for school days, made things easy for him. With Jake and with Grace. A natural mediator, EJ had waded into the middle of a fight even when they'd share the classroom. Not a close friend, but a mate. He rolled his shoulders and Satan pushed his nose into Ryan's hand. Animals were more reliable than most people, but a trusty dog couldn't shift this kind of tension. Grace had run free at his place as a kid, even when she was a bit more than a kid. He'd liked her loyalty to Danny even more, but he'd never given her a second look. Today's kick to his libido had been unforeseen and irritated the hell out of him, given she treated him as if he had some contagious disease. The contrast between the virginal white lace blouse and her usual work shirts had his head spinning. It softened her hard edges, made his fingers itch to unwrap this unexpected delight. Turns out her normal plain packaging was camouflage, useful for projecting a no-nonsense persona in the still largely masculine farming world. Up close, Grace Anderson wasn't all cool businesswoman. Jeans and boots were standard. The flimsy white cotton with lace and frills caressing her breasts and gathered at the waist told a different tale. It matched the photo of the little girls on her label. A sentimental streak? Danny always swore she had a marshmallow center beneath the quick temper, but that was a lifetime ago. Her wide-brimmed hat had lain discarded on a box behind her, and her sunglasses had been tossed aside when Ryan had arrived. Her clear green gaze had bored unflinchingly into his shades when she'd slapped him down. Confident right enough, mixed with a hint of vulnerability to twist his gut. Danny would have responded to her sensitivity, although even at 15 had been oblivious to the appeal of her soft scent cluster of brown curls, not quite pretty face and firm body. And Danny, or rather his brother's death, stood between Grace and himself. He smiled grimly. Grace would probably choke on her full cream tasty cheddar if she knew she had to thank him for the inclusion of organics at this year's event. The old-timers on the field day committee had taken some persuading. Logic had triumphed over prejudice, and wasn't that a surprise? He'd been a kid when he left town. Now, a wealthy landowner, he was learning the benefits of playing with the local decision-makers. Not that he'd ever forget how they'd met his mother's pleas for more time to pay her bills with closed doors. A landowner. Not in the sense of hereditary title. He bought, improved, and sold land, refusing to be emotionally attached to any patch of dirt. He'd gone that route once. His current plan was to sell the family farm when he'd built it up a bit more. It no longer held special value for him. When it came to Grace, he looked back in the direction of her booth. They just had to be able to rub up against each other in public without setting tongues wagging. The booth is officially closed at 5, and the first call at 4:30. The doors running the length of the exhibition hall were flung open to allow easier access for stall holders packing up and for shoppers who'd hung on for a last bargain to leave. The field day ended with a celebration, fireworks, a dance, which Grace had a plan to join until this unscheduled family meeting. She loaded a refrigerated van with her bags, flyers, and banners and unsold cheeses. She'd sold more cheddars than she'd expected, fewer than she'd hoped. Another van pulled up alongside. "Hey, Gracie, did you see yesterday's cryptic crossword?" "Yep," she nodded at Bluey. The grizzled old farmhand leaned out the window, his watery blue eyes squinting against the late afternoon sun. His muscled arm was a nutty brown in sharp contrast to the snow-white t-shirt he habitually wore. "Where are your sunglasses?" "Somewhere. I'm stumped by one clue. 2-cheese omelet dead marched." "I've got as far as 2 words, 4 letters, then 7. I'm guessing omelet means it's scrambled, so an anagram?" Bluey had started at the Wilson farm around the time Ryan left home and become a fixture. "I got that one," she admitted. "Don't keep me in suspense, girl." Bluey scratched his chin and rolled his eyes. "What's the answer?" "I'll tell you if you get yourself some sunglasses and start wearing them." She sauntered closer to his window. He'd also helped her out at their farm in the past. He'd been a part of her life for forever. "Deal." "You say that all the time." She softened her rebuke with a smile. "But I live in hope. Are you sure you didn't get this?" "Damn, I knew I should have got it." He slapped a hand on the steering wheel. There'd been plenty of malicious gossip flying around Danny's suicide. Bluey's reliable presence had protected Mrs. Wilson from the worst of it. Ryan hadn't been around to help. Yet Bluey had stayed at the farm when Ryan took over, and she'd never heard Bluey whisper even the slightest criticism of his new boss. "It's 2 words from dead marched. Cheese is another clue." She waited a heartbeat for his guess, then gave him the answer. "Eat 'em cheddar." "That's the answer? Eat 'em cheddar?" He hooted with laughter. "You're a sweetheart, Gracie. Save a dance for me tonight?" Her smile died. "Ella and Jake are up for the night." "Say hello for me." Bluey's smile winked out. "Give my best to your mom and dad." A sensitive man for all his gruff exterior. Grace didn't move as Bluey drove away. She was indifferent to the other workers packing up booths, the vans edging through the aisles and displays. 2 years since Chrissy's death, since Ryan's return. Memories surfaced. She'd shouted at him behind the church at his brother's funeral, and he'd stood silent, letting her treat him as her punching bag. She'd been oblivious at Chrissy's funeral, her gaze fixed on the wooden box housing her vibrant, irresponsible sister. Ryan's name had been in the condolences book she'd read a few months later. She hadn't known he'd been back in town when her sister died and wasn't sure what she thought about his attendance at Chrissy's funeral. He'd left town after one funeral and arrived in time for another. "Let it go, Grace," she mumbled. Growing up had taught her to understand Ryan's need to grieve in his own way. Chrissy's death had helped her accept it. Grief didn't excuse his abandonment of his mother. Helen Wilson had lost 2 sons that day. A vehicle tooted its horn, reminding Grace where she was. She returned to her packing. This part of the hall would be cleared out shortly and converted into a dance hall. Getting the big machinery and larger displays disassembled both here and in the outside exhibition spaces would take a few more days. A family meeting. They had them all the time. This one had an ominous ring to it. When she climbed into the cab, uneasiness settled in her stomach, like curdled milk.